my thinking was to use this time to answer questions, comment or reflect on some perspectives that you might want to bring to this discussion. Perhaps continue to describe some specific vectors of research that we've done, if you're interested in that. I'm open to making you part of this workshop and not just reflect what I think is important to say. So please feel free to comment and ask questions and interrupt me or whatever. In terms of the research, if that's something that we want to talk about, I can characterize my research in a few domains that might be relevant to discussion here. One is epidemiology. And I think the importance of understanding the prevalence rates for various types of problems within any population is critical. And the challenges that we've had in doing epidemiologic work in the musician community is inherent in the social structures for this community. So it's unlike being able to go into a workplace where you have people working in the same place every day or the same place every week or years. It doesn't really exist for musicians. It's very difficult to actually get a cohort of subjects to respond to some epidemiologic surveys, for instance. So our research has pushed forward different types of online survey approaches to attract participation from musicians. We've been doing that for quite a long time, and we've published several papers, including some very recent ones related to, for instance, trombonists and classical guitarists, euphonium players, tuba players, very recent studies. And the methodologies that we use, particularly to help us understand specific musculoskeletal areas of the body, have developed, and the way we ask questions about those areas and all that kind of stuff. So that's something that we could talk about if you're interested in. I can show you some, or talk about the way we approach that and some of the needs that I think are connected with those approaches. So that's one area. Another area is in biomechanics. So we think about the primary risks for musculoskeletal injuries in general. Most theoretical models would point to three factors associated with the task that would be the basis for the risk. And that's force, posture, and repetition. Anybody in musculoskeletal injury work would understand that. So we talk about force as it relates to musician health. You're talking about the physical energy, the physical pressing of a keyboard or the pressing of a mouthpiece against the face, or the forces of on the right thumb of a clarinet behind an instrument. So when we look at like the epidemiologic literature and we say, gee, where does it hurt? How much pain do you have? How frequently do you have it? How does it influence your performance? All those kinds of things. We can kind of see a body mapping, if you will, of the point of contact. In fact, that these biomechanical factors are at play. For example, in the clarinet, when we ask clarinetists where does it hurt, primarily it's the right thumb and right wrist area. Excuse me. So when you think about that, you say, well, where is the posture is something that's kind of fixed. It's really not much you can modify there. But the forces are something that we can analyze. So we've approached this kind of stuff with building sensors that allow us to quantify the amount of forces generated during performance. So specifically with clarinet, we developed with our engineering colleagues, two vectors, force sensor along the barrel of the clarinet, across the barrel of the clarinet, and then we can calculate out the resulting force angle. And so that was very enlightening. And to kind of think about, so we got the prevalence data, helps us focus on the body part. We studied the body part from a biomechanics standpoint, and then we learned something. For instance, with the clarinet, we learned that when we studied these forces, the influence of different fingerings on the instrument. So let's look at, you got two wind instrumentalists here, and I can ask them, what note do you think is the most hazardous note to play? And why? right? Well, it's the note that has all of the fingers off of the instrument except for the thumb, which is open G, because the gripping forces can't counter the compressive forces against the thumb this way. You with me? And that was really a huge insight for us, because we think about, okay, so what can we do about that? So there's maybe two specific solutions. We can put a neck strap on a student, an elastic neck strap, to help carry some of that force. And we've tested it because we had the sensor, and sure enough, you put a neck strap on, the force is significantly reduced. And so we advocate the use of an elastic neck strap for kids. And we've tested the pain-reducing aspect of that, and sure enough, it's less painful, less stress, less biomechanical force. And the other way to think about it is, how can we change how we make our music? Now, the interesting thing with this particular issue is that when a child is given a clarinet for the first time, the first note they learn to play is that note. So all the methods books that prescribe the pedagogical approach to playing an instrument needs to be revamped, reconsidered. So if you play B, you got a couple notes down, you can lessen the degree of stress on the right thumb. So somebody needs to write new methods books, curriculum for middle school, band classes and stuff like that, to engage a child in a way that produces less risk to their hand. So that's an area of biomechanics. Another example of biomechanics at work for us has to do with Mouthpiece Force. So in brass playing, when we do the epidemiologic literature, like for instance this trombone paper, in fact, Karendra was part of a publication we did, 10 or 12 years ago, looking at brass musicians. And we were comparing the differences in where it hurt across the four major brass groups: trumpet, trombone, French horn, and tuba. And we saw that there were different patterns. And we said, well, we don't have enough specificity, because the body mapping approach to the epidemiologic surveys didn't offer subjects to report pain in this musculoskeletal area. So we have some really interesting body maps that we do online that allow a subject to click and punch and then have a bunch of subsequent questions about that. And sure enough, trombone, the #1 most reported site in terms of prevalence and influence on the ability to play, is the facial muscles. So again, why does that hurt? Well, when somebody plays a brass instrument, they're literally pushing it into their face. So how much do you push it into your face? And there is some history to people trying to study that. And we wanted to get a little more precision, and so we developed with our engineering colleagues a force sensor that we have on a trumpet that allows us to measure 3 vectors of force when you're playing. Cartesian coordinate system, straight in, up and down, left and right, in real time. And it's the most fascinating thing to see when a trumpet player is playing, how variable this is and how different it is across trumpet players. And just, I mean, the face validity of this is to suggest that the more force you use, the more risk you will be faced with, right? And when we study people using this kind of technology, we've got data that has a lot of subjects play exactly the same type of music to a metronome, really high-level players, and we can compare, playing exactly the same music, but do you do it differently? And sure enough, the best players, the one with the least amount of injuries, manage that force. Low force averages, low force variability, low force load, cumulative load, lower peaks, and it's very instructional. So how do we then take that and help students learn about their own playing using that kind of technology? In fact, you can imagine looking at time series data in 3 vectors and relating that to somebody. It's pretty challenging. So we have some software that we developed that actually generates a holographic image of the face using the subject's data. So you can go to the computer and watch the face light up as a reflection of the forces that were generated. So how many were here last night, by the way? You saw me play? Yeah, a couple times I hit some high notes, loud, right? So I probably pushed it in. So if you were looking at the software, you'd see the lighting of my face as a reflection, a direct reflection, a quantitative analysis of the forces on my face. Actually, it results in a pressure representation. So I might be pushing it in, so you see this side of the face, right, or this side of the face, or up or down, and you can even tell where the forces are generated. So you grab the trumpet with your right pinky finger, you're probably pulling it in, so they're forcing it down. So you got more down here. It's really fascinating research tool and a pedagogic tool to help teach somebody about how they're playing. So force, measurement, postural assessment, and of course repetition are all factors that we want to investigate. How can we manage those issues? We've been doing it with some technology, doing it with some ideas that then manifest themselves in approaches to help remedy the problem. Any questions about that before I keep going?
I don't know whether it's a question or it's just in addition to what you... I'm saying I don't know whether it's a question or it's in addition to what you're saying, because both the earlier presentation and what you're presenting now shows that there are problems that what one would call occupational health hazards. And now I'm coming from a public health perspective where we believe in preventive and promotive health. And I'm just thinking, probably I'm thinking loud, on a project or research and maybe even a teaching module, which looks at how do we prevent and promote health in addressing the issues that you're raising. One of the things that came to my mind was if one is looking at taking almost all the health sciences, the programs in those, almost each and every program has something to offer in trying to prevent some of these issues that you've raised. We've already spoken with Chets, looking at just ergonomics, how you posture yourself, which is something that both the physiotherapists and the occupational therapist students or programs offer. How we look at almost all our programs, but just having a preventive and promotive, even starting from the point of awareness. Are people aware when they get into performing arts of the occupational health hazards that they're exposing themselves into, and how then throughout their programs they kind of like maybe are monitored? So if one were to look at a program where you would have a baseline information when students enter, and frequency of assessments and interventions at different levels, including health education for this is how you, early enough, before we even get to all these surveys that you're talking about, where now you're telling us about where is the pain, your body mapping and all, but we know it's going to happen because from your research already there is proof. But how do we then prevent and promote health? That's just one project that comes into my mind, both from the teaching as well as from the research perspective, and also the one that I think I mentioned when I raised the issue, where we make even that the unit have those units as clinical learning, teaching and learning sites, because in a way, students would then learn to know that for musicians, there is this. Now, if you intend to be an occupational therapist or an occupation health specialist, this is what you look for. It's just ideas at the moment, but I haven't crystallized
I wish we were at the same university.
Well, we can always be.
That's
and
right.
There's always a collaboration and
Yes.
partnership. I think that's...
I have come to believe that the public health discipline in general is a perfect partner with the music field, even more so than medicine, and perhaps any other field, public health, health education, health promotion, the principles of best practices that would undergird an approach to go into a school and help to instruct the students in a way that elevates awareness, knowledge, self-competency, and all the theoretical basis that health educators use would be very informative, ripe for integrating into this space. The public school music teacher would not be aware of that kind of knowledge. So that's a perfect example of integration of scholarship. We have not yet tested any of that. We just were successful in getting our state education agency to ratify new learning objectives that are mandated for every choir, band, and orchestra director in the middle schools and in high schools. And the learning objectives get more complicated as you go through the ranks. It's an awesome basis for figuring out how to do it. Like, for example, the first learning objective is a child needs to explore hygiene related to music. Hygiene related to, what does that mean? So we actually messed around with this a little bit, not formally in terms of research, but we went into a middle school, brought a toxicologist with us, brought some petri dishes, and passed out some rubber gloves, latex gloves to the students, and they were like, wow, this is like CSI, you know? And they took their instruments and they swabbed out their lead pipes of their trombones, and stuff was coming out, and they're wiping it on the petri dish, and you know, then we let that stuff grow, and we showed the students, right? They're exploring that hygiene issue. Clean your instrument, you know? I would assume that if we tested pre and post, we would have found some pretty significant positive results from doing that kind of thing. So yeah, we need models, we need examples, and I would assume that a public health scholar would recognize the uniqueness of all contexts and have to modify their message accordingly. So going into a school in North Texas would be different than going into a school in the rural areas of South Africa, I'm assuming, right? So that's stuff that we have to figure out. How can we get this message to resonate with these kids? The other areas of intervention are focused on hearing health. That's a really, really big problem, way beyond just the musician population, because kids in general could benefit. And there's a call internationally, the World Health Organization is calling for educational interventions to help kids understand the risk for noise-induced hearing loss due to all the music that they're consuming. And so even beyond the musician population, a public health initiative to go into the schools and tell kids in a way that resonates with them to lead to turn down their iPod and their earbuds and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't know how it is here in Africa, but in the United States, everybody's got something in their ear if they're a teenager, you know. And then, of course, the issues related to occluding the ear itself. This is an understudied topic. So when you block that ear and you generate all that energy inside the ear canal, there's nowhere for it to go. You get an acoustic reflex. The stapedius muscle stiffens up the tympanic membrane. It decreases sensitivity of the eardrum. So what do? You turn it up, right? So it's likely to increase the rate at which you might incur some kind of threshold shift, or yeah, lots to do there. So yes, we are just thirsty and eager to work with people exactly like yourself. And I would think this space would be highly interesting and educational for the young, you know, practitioner in any of the public health areas, whether it's biostatistics or health education or whatever. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry I came in late, so maybe asking a question.
I'm sorry, I'm late.
Oh, all right. I'm wondering whether this could be expanded beyond just using your music hat for us as an audience here of higher education curriculum designers. That by definition, higher education is based on discipleships of disciplines that have boundaries that are quite categorical and defined as boundaries. And what I think for me the inspiration of your talk is to be able to look at the production of new knowledge at the intersection between a variety of different so-called interdisciplines, multidisciplines, juxtadisciplines, transdisciplines, all of those sorts of issues. So I understand that this, you wearing the music hat, when you talk about the relationship. So, but let me use the music hat and say, it's not only the relationship between music and health, but what about music and social health? So if I want to look at one example, performance spaces and rehearsal spaces in drama and performance spaces, and how individuals negotiate their sexuality in those particular spaces. What I'm doing is intersecting worldviews of the performance space and the world of music with the worldview of gender identity and gender constructions. And what we might end up with is an insight into the intersectionality being where new knowledge needs to be produced. And for me, that is the long-term consequence of where we take your ideas of music and health, but to take it into other spaces as well. So that's more comment, but I don't know if other kinds of explorations into other relationships between music and other disciplines or boundary crossings might be possible.
Yeah, just a couple reflections on that. First is these boundaries are really important for everybody to recognize. And Karendra and I were having a discussion just a few minutes ago about this. The performing arts medicine community was initiated 35 years ago or so in the United States by physicians. And its evolution has sort of fed into the development of the competency of the physician to respond to a medical problem of a performing artist. And that's great, and we need that. We need audiologists who know how to deal with a musician problem. We need speech-language pathologists who know how to deal with musician problems. And yes, but the boundaries aren't, it would be inappropriate for a physician to come in and conduct an orchestra in a middle school or high school, or to tell the musician how to practice when that's not really their domain of expertise. So we have to figure out, and the reverse analogy would be for me to diagnose a medical problem. Even though I may be able to do that, or at least point to a causal factor or something, I'm not a clinician, I'm not trained, I'm not licensed, and it's inappropriate for me to do that. We do have some problems with people who get interested in this, and then they start to intervene, and there's some boundary transgressions that one might say is inappropriate. So yes, there's that. So a team approach is always best, and understanding your role is best, and understanding the language of each other is best. The other issue about the relationships across disciplines outside of medicine or health, yeah, we do a lot of stuff in psychology, sociology. We study things like, we just had a dissertation, a young girl who studied self-handicapping behavior among music students and its correlation with imposter syndrome. So, you know, to what degree is somebody self-handicapping, right, in order to save their ego from the perceived stress of not being as great as they want people to think they are? A really fascinating topic. And then, you know, this idea of being in a space where you assume a certain identity, but you're not really confident. So you're kind of presenting yourself, you're almost an imposter. You know, and there's formal, psychometrically sound tools that have been developed to measure these kinds of things, and we do that. Somebody was talking about social support, I believe, yesterday or this morning. That's another area where we've been investigating some of the sociological consequences, or not consequences, of realities that resonate in our music students. So we had a paper published recently where we looked at perceived social support among music majors compared to non-music majors. And we used, again, psychometrically sound available scales to measure this kind of stuff. There's 3 sub-factors, you know, social support from family and peers, and then significant others. Where do you think the differences were between these 2 groups? No differences between family, perceived social support from family, no differences between social support of peers, but significant others, significant differences. The musician is so wrapped up in doing what they're doing, they don't have time for relationships. And they feel, you know, like that's a missing part of their existence. So things like this we're exploring. Typically, we're driven to explore these issues for an understanding of a particular possible problem. You know, and a lot of times these research projects develop from students saying something about these kinds of things. And it's like, wow, yeah, that's a great idea. I never thought of that. Let's explore it. In fact, the social support project came from a young flute player working on a graduate degree. And she was talking about how her life is nurtured by having a pet at home. She brought that up in class, you know. I go home and thank goodness I have a pet, my dog or cat or whatever it is. That's a nurturing component to her life. You know, she practices all day, she's in class, it's very intense. She goes home, she has her dog, right? Dog welcomes her when she comes home. And I thought, well, that's really fascinating. Why don't you learn a little bit more about that? So we have a big university. Maybe there's a professor that has a little interest in this area. Sure enough, after a little investigation, she finds a psychology faculty who studies human-pet interactions. And she finds out that there's a journal about that. And there's some theoretical models that suggest that pets actually provide a social, you know, support mechanism. And so she's learning like crazy. She's integrating that over into her world. Her world was kind of articulated just on her own experiences. And then she finds out, wow, there's some tools and some theories. So let's test and see if this is something of interest in our world. And she did and published it. So it can go on and on about things like that. The athletic sports literature is ripe for integrating. They're 30, 40 years ahead of us. We had a doctoral dissertation recently where kind of, I think, related to what you're mentioning about body image and expression of self as a physical being on stage. So there is some research in sports looking at, you know, especially females, their perceived body image and the consequences to that in their diet and all these kinds of things, you know, bulimia and what's the other one? Anorexia, like in the dance community, you would think would be really big, right? And sure enough, yeah, it exists in the musician world. And some published data on that too. Anxiety is a big issue. We do a lot with that. We actually do a lot with identity. You know, if a student doesn't identify themselves or a person doesn't identify themselves as occupying that role that they're seeking to be, you know, there's a problem. And in sports psychology, there is a whole topic related to sports identity, or it's called athletic identity, I'm sorry. The athletic identity measurement scale that's been tried and tested all over the world, translated into multiple languages, and it's used as a screening tool for athletic programs in colleges. So a young athlete comes to school, they may identify too strongly with this activity and therefore forego studying and passing grades, you know, and all that kind of stuff. They're on the basketball court all the time. They're too strong. Everything in life is dependent upon how successful they are as an athlete. So we want to kind of think about that as it relates to the musician. So we've modified the athletic identity measurement scale into the musician identity measurement scale, studied musician populations, and we found out that our scores are higher than those that we see in athletics. Right? And wow, you know, I've had kids respond to this kind of stuff saying, there's nothing more important to me than my music. There's nothing important in my life other than music. Come to find out, that's the kid who had abusive parents or all by themselves or something like this. And you ask yourself, well, maybe that student needs to go to a counselor. Maybe they're in music for a reason that's not that healthy. You know, we actually do measurements of that too. Why are you doing this? You might find out that a student's doing that because that's the one thing that they found somebody to pat them on the back about. I can relate to that personally. My dad was hard, really hard. Criticized me no matter what. But boy, when I heard something positive, it was always about my trumpet playing. And it wasn't direct. It had to be from a friend of his. Hey, your dad was bragging about you last night. Or, you know, I'm a little guy, you know. Really? My dad talking positively about me? I better go do some more of that. Oh, is that a reason why I should go into music as a degree or a profession? Right? There's lots of really interesting dynamics when it comes to wrestling with these issues. Why are you stepping into this space to spend the next 4 years studying the clarinet or the piano or jazz. What's this all about? You know, Karenja's dissertation, you know, aspirations versus expectations of jazz musicians at the undergraduate level. Fantastic example of wrestling with that.
It's also an abusive relationship as well.
Oh.
Sorry, I'm just saying that that kind of identity construction could also be abusive. And I'm thinking of teacher identity research as well, is that individuals engage into these professions and careers as spaces in which they can enact those kinds of violences that they themselves have inherited or biographically, and then, you know, enact that out in strange ways in the way in which they perform their identity as teachers, for example. So, and may I just ask a question about alcoholism and the relationship? You hinted at Jack Daniels in your presentation this morning, but I was wondering whether you want to say a little more about that.
Yeah, I came into this as a research topic in response to a very interesting scenario that unfolded several years ago at the school, where we had sort of a parent orientation meeting for our entering freshmen. So we had a big hall and maybe a couple hundred parents coming, you know, school starting, and the university was parading some of the administrators and leaders, if you will, of the campus across the stage to give a couple welcoming comments to the parents. So the dean of the College of Music at the time, this was Dave Schrader, I believe, was with a child who was highly recruited, like world-class incoming freshman from wherever, I don't remember where, and he was there with the parents and this child. And the police chief got up there, it was his term of the campus, his turn, and he was talking about the campus and the things that go on, and he said, even though we have the largest music school in the country, our drug and alcohol problem isn't that bad. Even though we do a lot of this music making, our drug and alcohol problems aren't that bad. And the dean was furious. Furious. And of course where's the data, right? Kris, do you have any data on that? And I said, I don't know if there's any studies on alcohol problems among music majors versus non-music majors or anything like that. So I designed a study to assess that, and again went out into other arenas to find appropriate psychometrically sound tools to use to research this, and found a young adult alcohol inventory that's designed to assess lifetime problems with alcohol, current problems, and problems in the past year, something like that. And we also measured the degree of anxiety the students were experiencing, performance anxiety, you know, not only stage fright, but just getting up in front of a class and talking and stuff like that. And then we also took the counseling center's 50-item checklist. So when a student seeks counseling at the university, before they see a counselor, there's a checklist of things. You know, I got mild or severe, 50 items. And so we had those three measures. We gave it to a large cohort, maybe 700 students, music majors and non-music majors, freshmen and sophomore, underclassmen, and beginning. Did we find any significant differences? What do you think? All three of the alcohol scores were significantly different. The music majors were less. Lifetime problems with alcohol, past year and current. Less. On the performance anxiety measures, there were no significant differences. On the 50-item checklist, I can't remember exactly, I think there were like 10 items that were significantly different. We did a discriminant analysis, and we pulled out a factor that clearly showed that the music majors were healthier because they had an identity that was already established. They weren't concerned about what they look like. They weren't concerned about, you know, scheduling their day to get practice or homework done, because a musician already knows how to do that. They have discipline. They know who they are. I'm walking around with my saxophone. I know who I am. The non-music majors were like, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. This is all new to me, and I'm on my own, and I don't have the discipline. That was clearly evident in that. data. So it's fascinating. We haven't yet followed up on that to see what it's like at the end of the undergraduate experience, where the music major doesn't have the job fair to go to, but the student who picked a different field does. And the student who's in music is realizing, wow, at the end of this semester, I'm out of here. What am I going to do? Where am I going to go to make money? How am I going to pay my loan off? What am I going to do? So we think that some of this stress is going to change significantly at that level. And that might lead to more alcohol-related problems or social, kinds of consequences. So yes.
Hi, I very much enjoyed the keynote address as well, and I'm very interested in the kind of work you're doing at your university. I'm Alicia de Villiers. I'm from the Nelson Mandela University, and I'm in the music department. So I'm just interested to know, how do you, all this research and how does that, is it formalized within the undergraduate curriculum in your music department?
Yeah, that's a great question. Slowly. We have accreditation standards that pack up the curriculum as everybody's competing for time with their students as an A degree. What I did about 10 years ago or so, I targeted the core curriculum for that space. The core curriculum offers any college or division opportunities to generate credit hours outside of their, right? So if I have a core class, that means somebody from biology or engineering or wherever can come and take that class. So it's something that faculty encouraged to develop. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do that, and I got it approved, and I called it Occupational Health Lessons from Music. So I was able to focus on these music occupational health issues, but the whole idea was that they could be applied to any occupation. The lessons will be from the musical lens, but you can take this with you if you're going to be a nurse or whatever, right? A dental hygienist has higher prevalence rates for upper extremity musculoskeletal problems because of force, repetition, and posture more than musicians, right? You're sitting there, bent over, hunched, pushing stuff into people's teeth. Force, posture, repetition. So regardless of what field you're going into, these principles would be important for you. So that's, and when we started it was a windfall. I mean, I was having multiple hundreds of students every year. I think there's been 3,000 or 4,000 students through this course. But then the other core classes come around and everybody's competing for that. So the numbers aren't as great. But it's been a valuable experience for those students and a good opportunity for me to interject this kind of information into the curriculum. And then at the graduate level, we have set up a related field for our performance majors, which everybody has to select. So if you're going to school and you're going to be a clarinet major, that's your primary area, but you have to pick a related field. So it might be music history or music theory or composition or music education or jazz. Well, we have a related field called music and medicine. And that offers us the opportunity to have these kinds of discussions, especially at the doctoral level. A lot of students end up doing their dissertation, even though they're a performance major. They'll do like a PhD level dissertation in this area. So it's been an opportunity to interject that way. And now, like I mentioned this morning, we're right at the cusp of offering the first PhD exclusively in this area in music. So that would shift the emphasis from performance, that would be the related field. Research and performing arts health would be the primary area. And we're really looking forward to that. But the area that needs it most, I believe, is in music education. So the big breakthrough where our Texas Education Agency makes it mandatory that teachers now have to meet these learning objectives is the opportunity. Huge opportunity. Teachers who teach future teachers, faculty who teach future teachers know about this much related to any of these things. So we have to have new teacher training programs. We have to have outreach programs to our existing teachers, continuing education, all that kind of stuff. And we're just looking for the right kind of students or whatever, as somebody to do it.
Yeah, that's very interesting because many of our students want to become
music therapists, and to see how they can help people with social problems, and yet they themselves have problems. With the injuries and repetitive things, injuries and posture. And that's because at the moment we are busy thinking of, well, we have to recurriculate at my university. So coming here was very eye-opening for me to see all the possibilities that are out there. Thanks.
Yes.
I want to raise three things. The first one is about objects, spaces, and pedagogic approaches. And particularly within, I would say, foundation phase. I'm from science education. So
You're what? Say that again?
I'm from science education.
Science, yes.
So when I speak about objects, spaces, and the pedagogic approaches, what one has to then consider, for example, a young child, 4 or 5 years old, and that whole discovery, inquiry-based approaches, but the whole thing with sound and the particular objects and how that resonates and all those tonations, whatever you want to say. So that's the one issue I wanted to raise. The next issue is about students going into places where they have not had any experience about music education. And for example, there were students who went to a cerebral palsy institution, and this is part of their service learning. And when they were there, they suddenly started discovering other activities that they could do with the people in wheelchairs. So there were 5 young children in wheelchairs. So what did they do? They made, and Prof. Devroep knows about this because I've discussed it with him, but they made objects, musical objects, using toilet rolls to fit into a spastic hand. And the students designed this themselves. So there were these students playing music, and it was an absolutely fantastic experience to see this concert in process. Because the music was going, and these children were playing their objects, and they were singing along in whatever way they could actually do it. And the placement site manager was enthralled because she had never thought that she could use the music in that particular way. And exactly the point about music education, zilch at Edgewood campus. So Prof is going to come there, and hopefully we can get something going. How can you be a teacher in a primary phase and not have music? There's music in everything that we do, but unfortunately, we sound dead, too many of us.
Yeah, see, I see the world, from my context, and I'm very fortunate that, in Texas, every child in the public school has a music education experience in every grade. It's mandatory, and it's an exceptional educational experience. You go to another state in the United States, they don't have that. They cut the arts. In Texas, it's really, really powerful. In fact, there at our university, we have a really strong preschool music education experience. So like kinder music or whatever, I forget what it's called. Warren Henry started this years ago. So parents can bring their toddler even to campus, and they have activities like what you're talking about with little kids. It's all engaging with music. But as soon as they get into the public school kindergarten, there is a music specialist on that campus. And that student would see that specialist pretty much every day. Yeah. Yeah. Powerful. Yeah.
And just to follow up on what was said now, I think the issue that we have is around funding. And from my experience, working with program accreditation for the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I find that one of the things that we need to, that we're concerned about is around funding. So, for example, and I know I can see people frowning, but it is a reality. Maybe you could, just give us your experience in a situation where, for instance, if CHUTS has to move to music, or even or health sciences moves to music, it has to do with staffing and funding. So I think that is what we need to think about, because as disciplinary teams, people may be quite eager to develop their programs and so on, but at a higher level, it has funding implications. And staffing, you know, it has implications for staffing. So maybe if you could enlighten us around your experience
I know
of that.
Chats is chomping at the bit to respond to that. And
A question with that.
pardon?
I've got a question together with that, so you can probably.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I agree fully with what Tilly is saying. That's quite important. I agree fully with what Tilly is saying. It's quite important. Mine is an extension of her question, and I want to know what is the level of industry collaboration and participation in your program. We're not going to get money from our institution. We know that. Nationally, there's a cap on what we're going to be getting. So we have to source, third stream, fourth stream, and fifth stream income, from where we're going. So I'd like to know how you've managed that also in your program. Or is there a budget within your university for growth and development? Or are you getting a partnership in from the outside? So it ties in with Tilly's.
I've had some success with grants, but I have not let that lack of success stop me from doing what I want to do. And I'm a firm believer that you can do the impossible if you're willing to do what's possible. Okay? And taking those first steps, knowing that it's a long haul to get to your vision fully to fruition, it's hard. But it's always something that's possible. And I would think, after what I've been hearing here over the last couple of days about research in South Africa and the money available for that, and the lack of interest among faculty to tap into that funding is the opportunity. If you have a rationalized need, right, so you can argue as a scholar for testing something for some reason, right, a musical intervention in this population for these ends, right? If you do that as a scholar, you might be successful in convincing those who have the research dollars to fund a project. And not only would it support what you need to do, but it also encourage the dissemination of the findings that you get from your project, which would then help support the next level of advance, if you will, based on what you found in the first step. I'm under the impression that there's a lack of scholarly rigor and activity in the arts research community here in South Africa. Or there's a type of research that doesn't really address social issues or needs. It's more philosophical or perhaps musicological. It's not like, hey, we got this problem, and my purpose of my study is to address this problem. And it seems like you got a lot of problems that need to be addressed. So, and there's funding to address those problems. So that's the key to get funding. But I also I wanted to mention this morning, I forgot. For my students who are young researchers and colleagues who maybe even be seasoned faculty but less experienced as researchers, I kind of tell them that, being a researcher is a little like being a karate guy or even a musician, where the expectation is to perform as you're advancing in your abilities, and you're never done advancing your abilities. So, I don't know if I'm a white belt, a yellow belt, a green belt. Maybe I'm a black belt in some people's eyes because of the numbers of publications. But my students, when they start learning how to do research and they have to do it, okay, you're a white belt. It still means you have to get up and perform. You got to do what you can do with what you know and what you have now. There is a possibility to go and do that study at some level based on the resources you have, which could be nothing. Do it. It's just like a musician. You start taking lessons in piano, you got to do your recital. You go to music class, you got to get up there and perform. Research is a performance practice. You got to do it. You can sit around and talk about it all day, but doesn't mean anything unless you go and do it. The scholarship is, a verb, just like music is a verb. Being a scholar means you're doing something. So I think the opportunity is in connecting the need to, or looking at the need, trying to facilitate that need with a scholarly argument, that might connect what you're interested in looking at to that need, like application of music to solve this problem or whatever, and go to the funding agencies. I even hear you guys get paid for publishing papers. Man, I wish I had that. Nobody's paid me for publishing a paper. It's crazy. You know, that just blows my mind. And the fact that faculty aren't publishing papers, even though you get paid, that just blows my, I don't get that. Yes, I don't know if that helps, but what I tell my students and my colleagues, like what I'm saying now, yeah, it's always possible to go out there and do something with nothing except for your passion and your intellect. Yes?
I'm thinking and extending the debates around the systemic challenges that we have. And I am one of the examples of crossing over between education and health sciences in the kind of interdisciplinary work that we actually do. But from a systemic point of view, at UKZN, our institution, we have a system where even though you might cross-collaborate in this particular way, you cannot count it as part of your workload because you're not disciplinary based. So here you can see some of the systemic challenges in terms of working cross-collaborative. So when Chats comes over to education, he does this Deo Grazia, pro bono kind of work, and it's not recognized in any way. In the same way, the scholarship in the National Research Foundation also talks about one's rating as a scholar is in relation to your singularity of your specialization rather than your cross-collaboration. So in the sense that part of the systemic choices that we need to be thinking about are policy ones as well, of how we're needing to be rethinking the idea of collaborative work and what supports collaborative work. But I take your challenge. Certainly the way in which the School of Education in our context at the moment has elaborated on this is to introduce a PhD in higher education studies. And what we do is we have individuals who cannot exist in their own disciplines to do the kind of work that they're doing and the challenges to the designing of their curriculum, and therefore move over into the School of Education to research interdisciplinary ways of thinking about bringing educational discourses to bear in health sciences, computer sciences, whatever the kinds of disciplines that we're working on. And so that, in a sense, beats the system because the student has to leave their faculty and move into the School of Education, into another faculty, so to speak, and therefore can be registered there, and then those supervisors who are supervising usually are the main supervisor with a co-supervisor from somewhere else. So I'm saying we have to find creative ways of beating the system, and it's also about how we design our systems. So it means some erasure of territory boundary crossing, and that permeability can be designed, and it is possible. Currently, we're sitting with over 50 PhDs in higher education studies across the continent, across disciplines, as a consequence of opening up that space, of being able to say, now we have the possibility of being able to design and rethink. But it meant individuals having the courage to be able to engage with the collaboration and then set up alternatives to beat the system. Last point, nevertheless, the National Research Foundation will regard our programs as being not contributing to the scholarship that we are supposed to be, and how we rated as scientists are in relation to that. And that's got to do with promotion tracks and et cetera in the academia. So I just thought maybe that might open up comments from other institutions in terms of different ways in which they choose to disrupt higher education.
Yeah, that's a can of worms. Yeah, I have pursued my career perhaps less informed than I should have been about the consequences of what I was researching, how I was researching, how I was fitting in. You know, I took a path that was different. I'm still the only person in any school of music with a job like mine, kind of self-created. I had to stay in the research assistant professorship track without tenure possibilities for a while. I was comfortable with that. I didn't make my decisions based on these kinds of concerns. I made my decisions based on what I wanted to do as a human being. I was given these tools, and I saw this issue that meant a lot to me, and I pursued it. And it led to a recognition, and it led to now, wow, people say, wow, he's changed the discipline of music. Oh my God, So I think some of it is just based on individual passions and drive to do what ultimately is the top of the hierarchy of things that you want to get done in life. And, I think that's a reflection of how I've approached this, and it's kind of paid off, even though it's been many, many years where I felt like I was marginalized or not getting due, support or credit, but it did get published, it did make a difference, it does have an impact, and that seemed to outweigh the concerns I had for this other stuff, and those things kind of caught up. And by virtue of showing by example the promise and the progress that comes with working in teams, my university has certainly responded to that. They're giving me the opportunity to have this new PhD based on the successes I've had in doing just this.
Sorry, if I may just comment that from the health science perspective, and speaking to the Dean of Health Science, who's new to our institution, is that we've had occupational therapists, physiotherapists, speech hearing therapists, medical doctors, lawyers, etc., all part of this kind of cross-disciplinary way. And part of it has got to do with that the health science faculty wouldn't accommodate them to do that kind of research. And so they had to find other spaces to be able to activate it. So maybe given that we have a new dean teaching and learning, that might be a possibility of being able to say, well, why aren't we creating the same kinds of spaces within the faculty home disciplines that individuals are? So I'm just saying that this crossover has been very useful for the School of Education because it has a higher education curriculum orientation and focus, but certainly it's spaces that medical school. I've just recently come back from working in the medical school at UCT, in which they are now suddenly realizing the benefit of bringing together people with divergent paradigmatic positions and epistemological bases other than the positivist kind of ways of doing doctoral education. So I think the students are willing. The space is there, but our systems and structures often disable us from actually acting creatively. But there are spaces you can disrupt.
Yeah, and I would just throw this one idea out too that you might want to leverage in your discussions about moving into this arena. There are some disciplines that have actually targeted the musician population because of its unique characteristics. Neuroscience, for instance. Neuroscientists love to study the musician's brains because the activity that a musician does involves extremely coordinated neuromusculoskeletal control, visual acuity, oral sensitivities, emotionalities, all kinds of memory, interconnectedness between people. There's a very, very few professional activities or occupational activities that elevate to that kind of interest, for a brain scientist. I would think in the public health sector that this offers a unique opportunity that's untapped, that would be exciting to move into, right? You're going to go out and work on, AIDS prevention or obesity or, homelessness or drugs and alcohol. I mean, it's a problem area. It's a public health issue. You just probably haven't thought of it that way. And because it's an intact group with the unique problems, there's a lot to learn, right? And you might find that, wow, through the music experience, you might find that, wow, that's a great way to teach a child about something that we're having trouble teaching them about anyway, indifferent from music. You know, for years in the pediatrics literature, there's been a call to teach kids about hearing health early as possible. And people have thought about how can we do that? We'll put it in the science curriculum, do the nurses do it, who's doing it? It never has happened. Maybe the music teacher could be the answer, right? So yeah, think about the challenge of this interdisciplinarity relationship as one where you argue, wow, this is a population of interest that fits our needs. We need to have opportunities for research. This is a great problem area, a great challenge for us.
Sorry, if there's not another comment. I think part of the challenge in our execution of this responsibility of interdisciplinary work has been that individuals need to, as you were suggested, realize the boundaries of their own expertise and what that actually means to be collaborating. Because I think oftentimes what happens is people feel threatened that they're being overtaken by another discipline, a kind of what I call epistemological colonialism happening, where one worldview starts imposing onto another worldview. And I think the space needs to be created in the way in which we co-supervise and the way in which we engage with it. So in our current doctoral education program, we work in what you described in your presentation as doctoral teams or study teams in which groups of supervisors and groups of students come together at different levels of the journey of engaging with this interdisciplinary dialogue. What it does, nevertheless, is threatens the supervisors in the process, because supervisors feel that their boundaries also begin to be contested. And from that point of view, the way in which one negotiates the space to allow for that dialogical collaboration to happen has to be very carefully architectured. And those who come from disciplinary boundaries, who are very protective of their paradigms and protective of their worldviews, feel extremely threatened, and their master authority begins to be challenged. So I do think that one of the issues is how we think about our doctoral education model as well, which means there has to be a sufficient degree of confidence of the supervisor to be able to understand the necessity of boundary permeability, of being able to engage with this dialogue that happens across. I think it's taken 20 years.
Let me just comment. You know, last night, when I walked off the stage, there was a couple of people that made the same comment to me, which was, you never met those people before, did you? No. You didn't know what you were going to play, did you? No. You didn't know what key it was going to be. You didn't know anything, did you? No. Man, it sounded like you guys practiced and rehearsed. You were together, right? And I just want to use that as sort of an example of how people can work together when there's a basic understanding. And as somebody who's published in occupational health journals, audiology journals, biomechanical journals, medical journals, I publish in all kinds of different journals, right? There's a commonality. There's a language. There's an undergirding mode of operation, if you will, when it comes to research. You know, data is data. Analyzing data is, yeah, there's lots of ways to do it, but there's some fundamental principles that every researcher should grasp, just like every jazz musician should understand before they get on stage. So when you're dealing with scholars, you know, public health, let's go. We could data. I understand data. You understand data. I understand psychometrics. I understand, you know, recruitment, IRB, all that kind of stuff, just like any researcher should. Right? So we should be able to work together. I think part of the problem is this sort of self-imposed hierarchy of I know more than you, right? You know, and as a musician, that's really frustrating. Wait a minute, because I'm a musician, you don't think I understand regression or discriminant analysis or sampling techniques or whatever it is, right? I can learn it just like you can, you know? If you're threatened by that, go away. I'll find somebody else. You know? And I think the analogy to the jazz context, like I kind of drew to this morning, is, right, I'm going to bring something that may be different than what you bring to the table. I hope I do, and I hope you do to me. Right? And I'm going to be open-minded and receptive to that. And I'm going to be interactive with you. Just like, I remember it was one moment last night we were playing, and I was doing something, and the drummer was right there with me. It was amazing. It was like we were the same musician playing the same. It was just a rhythmic thing that just emerged, and I knew, he knew, we were like this. One mind, and in time, boom. When that happens with research, here we go. We make decisions every day, all the time, about what we want to do. As soon as I feel like, wow, you feel superior to me because you have a degree in biostatistics and I don't, you don't want to work with me, then somebody else.
I hear your concerns, and I think I bring some level of background, having worked with Kris. For those of you who don't know, Kris was my major professor. I studied with him for many years. In fact, the reason why I developed as a researcher was because of Kris. When I went to North Texas, I had not read a single article, yet I had finished a master's degree at UKZN. What I noticed was from day one, there was, especially at the Center for Music and Medicine, where Kris was managing, it was always about possibilities. It was always about what's the question and how do we answer it. Not there is this obstacle, there is that obstacle, will that person work, will not. I felt, to be truthful, I felt very intimidated the first time I sat in on a meeting. Yes, Kris Chesky, is George Kondrowski, who was a professor of engineering, and John Hippel, professor of psychology, and Bernard Rubin of rheumatology. And I felt very insignificant, very incompetent, but something that was drummed into me all the time is you've got to learn. You take, like you say, in a jazz situation, you take the plunge, keep your mouth shut and learn as much as you can. But what I did learn is that in the US, because there is no incentive for finances, there is no monetary rewards, except you've got to keep your job. If you don't publish, it's the publish or perish. You don't publish, you do not get tenure. So your job is on the line. So in a way, you're kind of forced to do it. And I guess that's why staff members overseas are much more willing to collaborate. They see possibilities rather than, and I find that even at our institution, UNISA is a big institution, and you know, we encourage, the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor encourages us to engage in interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary research, but there's reluctance, you know, and there's always the excuse, time, it's something that I never experienced overseas. Whether it was at North Texas, whether it was at Elizabethtown College, there was always the willingness to engage with other researchers. I think the crux of it lies with the students. That if you, as a supervisor, you're teaching a course in research methods and you've got some students, it starts there by encouraging them to engage with people outside of their field. North Texas has one of the largest music departments around. But my first interaction with researchers were students from audiology. For the first time, I sat next to a student who was in audiology, and we were engaging in research. And I think that's where it has to start, at that level. And if we encourage students at that level, you have to think about working with other departments, working with other students, even student research. You know, the one other thing that really struck me was my first stats course that I took, and we were required to take stats. The professor at the time, he said, you have one of two options. You can either take the final exam, or you can co-publish or co-write a paper with me and have it ready for submission at the end of the semester. Whether it gets published or not is immaterial. But at an initial level, you write a paper with me as a supervisor or as a co-author, and you have it ready. And my first publication was with AERA, because that's the challenge that was presented. So I had the option of take an exam or have a paper ready, which was a very simple paper. There was no data, there was no stats. It was just a position paper. He said, take a few other articles, sum up, state your position, full stop. And that was it. That's what we lack. At our institutions, we don't encourage it. Kris and I were talking about how we supervise our doctoral, masters and doctoral students, and he was surprised that we don't have committees. And his question was, how do you do it without a committee? We have to start thinking outside of that framework, because each of us are not experts at everything that we do. No matter how advanced we are and how much we read, we're reliant on somebody else. I'm not sure if that answers your questions. But I honestly believe if the funding incentive was removed, I got a feeling you may have a few more productive researchers in the country, if your job depended on it.
Sorry, just a comment for the floor more than directly to you, is that in the School of Education here at UKZN, our intention is to really develop a scholarship about what doctoral education actually means. And all of those kinds of inputs and designs and strategies of trying to look at alternative models of how one engages with the construction of postgraduate education is very much uppermost in the agenda of our post. We're sitting at the moment in a school of about 150 staff members with over 360 PhD students from all over the world. And the way in which we engage with that is by rethinking those very things that the last speaker was commenting on how one changes the nature of the relationship. But I do think there comes a tipping point, or what I'm calling a threshold point, where you now have supervisors supervising students across continents, disciplines, spaces, etc., where we are exhausted. It's beginning to become a kind of, I won't go into anymore. It just becomes, there's a threshold point at which one needs to be able to say massification is not the solution.
Based on my conversations with Corinthia, he was talking about the process, and I was shocked at the fact that the doctoral student doesn't have to submit a proposal for a research study and have it approved before initiating the study. You do? We don't have a formal proposal, and you can't actually a public setting. We do. Okay, but then that varies from university to university. So UKZN must be the only university.
Among faculties too. At my university, education does it as a public defense. I'm in the arts faculty or humanities, and there is no public defense. But they do submit a proposal which is read in the department and at the school level, and then at the faculty level before it's finally approved.
It makes the process, I can imagine, it's much more efficient. And We had a formalized study. This is exactly what's going to happen, and the student meets those criteria they were approved to meet. Then there would be less time spent responding to something that you didn't previously understand what happened, which is what I was interpreting as you were saying. So I know for me, it's very, very important to make sure that that proposal for the dissertation is just lock solid. I mean, it's clear as a bell, logic to, lead to a purpose statement with great clarity. The methodology is clear. I could replicate what you're going to do based on what you're writing now. So it's easy to know when you're done and if you're satisfied what it is that you're planning to do. So, anyway.
I will change the topic completely. Well, you've all been talking about occupational health, and have you had any research with cross-pollination with leadership and music and leadership development as kind of how to develop leadership through the use of music? Because that's an area that I'm quite interested in, because we spend billions on leadership development, but we find in our programs or developments that we have are not very effective. So I was wondering how, because you were talking just now about how you got up on the stage and that synergy just kind of worked and led the group and it just kind of a team. So that's what we're missing in leadership. How do we develop that through music?
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I don't know of anybody that's explored that. But that's a very interesting idea. I think the challenge would be in the ability of somebody to be musical. So somebody comes to this program and they don't know how to play an instrument, they don't know how to, do music. The facility of developing leadership through music would be a challenge. But if you already know how to play, I would suspect it would be easier. Or at least to, it's interesting, I guess, like I have really close colleagues in engineering, and they often tell me about how they use music examples to encourage. In fact, it happens in medicine too. So I have an engineering colleague who always tells his students, look, you have to practice engineering just like a musician practices their instrument. Every day you have to do it. You have to keep building your skills. In our medical school is osteopathy, right? So as osteopathic medical school, and the subspecialty of osteopathic manipulation is one of the cornerstones of this medical school. And my colleague, who's a professor in that department, he's always telling his students, same thing, you have to practice. You have to practice, so you have to be like a musician. You got to be dedicated. You got to do it every day, and you'll get better over time. But clearly, even from a young age, I have 3 children. They're all very accomplished musicians in multiple instruments, and I've seen their personal growth when they get up from getting up on stage, having to perform in front of an audience. I'm here. I practiced. Here it is. So by the time a kid, it kind of relates to that 50-item checklist I was mentioning before. Just entering freshman in a school of music has a lot of self-confidence because they've been doing this. They know how to get up in front of people and deliver the goods. So yeah, but that's a really interesting research project. Well, I certainly appreciate everybody coming today. Again, I'm sorry about being late. I'm going to blame it on Karendra. No. We were so focused on our little discussion that was fascinating. We misread the schedule, so we were just upstairs talking. But anyway, my interest in what you're doing here is really high. I can't wait till next week to be in Pretoria with Karendra, having a conference specifically looking at the launching of the South African Performing Arts Medicine Association. So this might be a way for your school to really glue together and other programs to capitalize on this new synergy that hopefully will happen nationally here. And hope to come back soon someday and participate in more stuff. And if you're ever in Texas, you're more than welcome. Visit the university or contact me via email. Love to hear from you and collaborate if possible. And thank you for attending today.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, we're starting a project now together with education to get greater interest in music and music education from the School of Education rather than just sitting in the arts school. So, because music education has been crippled in the education system. And we are trying now to develop a program. In 2 weeks' time, I think it is, or 3 weeks, we got a first collaboration between music and the arts. So I'm delivering the first talk, which I think is going to snowball. We hope it's going to snowball. Colleagues, thank you very much. Firstly, thanks to Prof. Kris Chesky, our good friend in the US. Thanks for coming through, and our regards to our colleagues on the other end at the University of North Texas. Thank you as the audience. Thank you very much for attending and for your incredible contributions. I wish that I had more individuals from my school, School of the Arts here, including my colleagues. I see my students here, but my colleagues not here, and that for me is surprising. And last but not least, I want to thank my brother who's here. It's not a nepotistic move, but he was very instrumental in actually getting Kris to come, you know what I mean, all the negotiations that went sort of 4 ways between myself, Robbie, my brother, and Kris, and these emails were going. So thank you very much also to all of you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. By the way,